Good afternoon. My name is Ulrich Lehner and I'm a professor in the theology department here at the University of Notre Dame, and I welcome you all to this afternoon's event. It's my honor to guide you through this afternoon, and this requires me also to make two official announcements beforehand. The first one is we ask you not to take photos, videos, audio recordings, since we have a video of the lecture available probably by tomorrow on the law school's YouTube channel. We ask that everybody is respectful, and I was also told to say if you're disruptive, you'll be asked to leave. I hope that's not necessary. The second announcement is that the University of Notre Dame requires that all visitors wear masks for indoor events. Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to first introduce, on behalf of the sponsor, the Religious Liberty Initiative and the Theology Department, Marcus Cole, the Joseph Mattson Dean of the University of Notre Dame Law School, followed by Professor Tim Madovina, Chair of the Notre Dame Theology Department. Dean Cole, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As Professor Lehner mentioned, I am Marcus Cole. I am the Dean of Notre Dame Law School, and I want to welcome you to this event celebrating the work of His Eminence Gerhard Cardinal Müller, co-sponsored by the Notre Dame Department of Theology and the Notre Dame Law School Religious Liberty Initiative. The Notre Dame Law School Religious Liberty Initiative was established just last year, and it is already the largest structure of its kind anywhere in the world, working to preserve and defend religious liberty wherever it is threatened. It is a comprehensive effort designed to bring together scholarship, advocacy, and education to advance religious freedom. The mission of the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Initiative is to promote human flourishing by serving as a source of advocacy, counsel, scholarship, training, fellowship, and hope in defense of the fundamental human right of religious liberty for people of all faiths. The cornerstone of the Religious Liberty Initiative, the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Clinic, has already defended the religious freedom of groups as varied as the Apache tribe in Arizona, fighting to protect sacred lands from commercial development, Muslim organizations in New York standing up for the rights of Orthodox Jewish schools, and Catholic families in Maine seeking fairness in school funding. As part of the Religious Liberty Initiative's educational mission, we are proud to support events such as this one. It is our honor at Notre Dame Law School to welcome His Eminence Cardinal Müller at an event such as this to promote faith as part of the Catholic mission of the University of Notre Dame. Thank you for being here.
In 1990, then Cardinal Ratzinger, in his role as Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued an instruction on the ecclesial vocation of the theologian. In his comments to journalists at the press conference when he released the instruction, Cardinal Ratzinger opened with the following remarks: "The importance of the theologian and theology for the entire community of believers became evident in a new way during the celebration of the Second Vatican Council. Up until then, theology was viewed as an occupation for a restricted number of clergy, as an elitist and abstract activity, which could barely merit interest on the part of church public opinion. The new way of looking at the faith and expressing it, which was affirmed by the Council, was the result of the drama produced by a new theological reflection, which began after World War I in connection with new spiritual and cultural movements. And he went on from there very eloquently. Cardinal Müller, on behalf of the Department of Theology, I welcome you in the spirit of these words of Pope Benedict. We welcome you as a bishop and now cardinal, as a former prefect of the congregation yourself, and as a fellow theologian who has dedicated so much of your life to the vocation Pope Benedict spoke of so eloquently. I've been asked to offer you a very particular welcome. Our distinguished colleague, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, is now an emeritus member of our faculty residing in his native Lima, Peru. When I told him last week that you would be lecturing on campus, he asked that I be sure to greet you in his name. In Father Gustavo's words, es un gran teólogo y un gran amigo. So on behalf of Gustavo and all of our faculty and students in the Department of Theology, Cardinal, we are grateful for your many years of service to the Church and to theology. And we are honored to welcome you to campus to pray with us and to offer today's lecture. Thanks to all, and welcome to our distinguished guest.
Before I introduce our great speaker, I would like to inform you also a little bit about the format of this afternoon. After the lecture, we will not have an open Q&A. Instead, we have chosen 3 professors from 3 different departments, history, law school, and theology, to ask questions so that we stay on topic this afternoon. Dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Your Eminence, if the Vatican had a basketball team, Cardinal Gerhard Müller would be the center. Not just because of his height, but also because of his intellectual brilliance and steadfastness. No controversy ever made him flinch. As professor of dogmatic theology in Munich, where I met him for the first time over 20 years ago, he cared deeply about one thing: the truth incarnate in Jesus Christ. We students recognized this immediately, and he was one of the few professors always available for our questions and concerns, always listening like a good pastor. One could always see that he lives out his faith with Lebensfreude, a zest for life that reflects the joy of the gospel. Unlike those who follow the modern trend of exchanging the treasures of our faith for counterfeit, like Hans in the Luck, Hans im Glück, who started his journey with a lump of gold only to give it up for a worthless grindstone, he defends the whole of the Catholic faith, always seeking to demonstrate its intelligibility and its beauty. As a student of Karl Lehmann, Cardinal Müller's theology is deeply influenced by the works of Karl Rahner, but also by Dietrich Bonhoeffer and St. John Henry Newman. As a professor, he didn't pursue the most fashionable projects, but those which could serve the Church the most. Among his many books, we find works on the veneration of the saints, the virgin birth, and priestly ordination. In 1995, he single-handedly accomplished what Karl Rahner, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Joseph Ratzinger aspired to, but never achieved: a 1-volume Catholic dogmatic theology that presents all treatises according to the needs of the time. Nevertheless, in all of his academic work, he never forgot the special love Christ has for the poor, be it as a wandering pastor in the slums of Lima and the Peruvian Andes, or as a propagator of a theology of liberation. In 2002, St. John Paul II appointed him Bishop of Regensburg, where he assumed the cathedra of another scholar bishop, St. Albert the Great. There he founded the Pope Benedict Institute, which oversees the publication of the collected works of the Papa Emeritus. Appointed by Pope Benedict XVI in 2012 as Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, he was confirmed in his office by Pope Francis until his departure in 2017. Far from retiring at age 70, he immersed himself once again in academic scholarship and has produced, I hope I counted correctly, 7 books over the past 4 years. His readers are grateful for his wisdom and theological acuity, especially when explaining what Catholic teaching is and what it is not. Most recently, in 2021, Pope Francis has appointed Cardinal Müller to the Supreme Tribunal of the highest Vatican Court, the Apostolic Signatura. We are grateful, Your Eminence, that you're here today to present insights from your book, The Pope, His Mission and His Task, and we look forward to your talk about the popes as guardians of human dignity. Thank you so much for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, but better said, brothers and sisters in Christ, the subject of this reflection is the popes as guardians of human dignity, but Pope not meant only as an individual, but also as a representative of all Christians of our common mission. Jacques Maritain, one of the finest minds ever associated with the University of Notre Dame, once wrote that only a Christian philosophy of life would guide a vitally, non-decoratively Christian city, a city of human rights and of the dignity of the human person, in which men belonging to diverse racial stocks and to diverse religious creeds would commune in a temporal common good and common work truly human and progressive. In today's secular world, in which the philosophy of life is increasingly unknown or is openly rejected, the Church needs to proclaim in more courageously than ever. It is, after all, the only way toward a city of human rights and the dignity of the human person. First point, the prophetic voice of the Church. The whole Church participates in the prophetic ministry of Jesus, her Lord and Head. This means that each and every one of Christ's followers is called both to help all people reach their eternal goal in God and to take responsibility for the common good. It is true that Christ's kingdom is not of this world, where the mighty have their power over their nations and suppress them. But the apostles are sent to all the crucified and risen Lord, to whom all authority has given in heaven and on earth. Thus, in the name of Christ, there is never a justification for injustice and oppression and exploitation, or the deprivation of freedom and degradation of others, but only the sacred authority to oppose injustice in all its manifestations. At the beginning of his public ministry, Jesus refers to himself with the messianic words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year, long time, acceptable to the Lord." Thus there can never be a dichotomy between eternal salvation and temporal well-being, just as there can never be a reduction of the gospel to a worldly welfare program. Our human existence can never be cut off from our supernatural calling to eternal communion with the God of triune love. Both belong inseparably together. The unity of our universal orientation towards God and our concrete responsibility for the world are rooted in the two core convictions of the Christian faith: the creation of the world by God and the mystery of Christ as fully human and divine. The Second Vatican Council spoke of an autonomy of earthly realities, which means that the human mind is not only able to understand nature and history progressively, but also to use new philosophical and scientific achievements for the benefit of the common good. The Council thus elaborates the second creation account in Genesis, where it says, "The Lord God took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it." The divine command to cultivate and care for creation, however, does not only entail respect for nature, but also indicates that our lives are spent in a pilgrim state. We are at home in the world, but working toward a higher goal. This goal, however, is not of this world, but concerns our union with God. The higher aim, however, does not absolve us from taking good care of what God has put into our hands. Preserving animal and plant life and keeping our air and water clean are universal goods. If the Christian vision of the human person is taken seriously, then the defamation of humanity as a pest of all other creatures, and as transhumanists allege, can be easily refuted. The Church has two goals. On the one hand, she brings people to Jesus as the primary sacrament of salvation of the world. Yet she has also works for the natural goal of the unity of mankind, sacrament for the union with God, but also sacrament for the unity of mankind. That's the basic definition of Church mission in Lumen Gentium. Striving for holiness and better living conditions, worship and civic responsibility, adoration of God and conversation of nature, historical consciousness and openness to the future do not dialectically exclude each other. No, they are rather assigned to each other through the analogy of being and the analogy of faith, like nature and grace, faith and reason, immanent and transcendent perfection. When the Church addresses on behalf of all persons the moral principle of human action, she is not motivated by a lust for power or supremacy. Moreover, she also does not interfere in a realm outside her competency, because, as we have seen, she must also care for the world. When she speaks, she defends and promotes the irrefutable truth that every human being exists for its own sake and must never be a means to an end. Immanuel Kant. Psalm 8 calls this inalienable dignity or splendid majesty which clothes the human person in divine splendor and glory. A person should never be thought of merely as a member of a species, a marginal blip in the history of evolution. Humans are ends in themselves and not means for achieving this or that worldly goal. We are people and we deserve to be treated as such. Christianity even proclaims that humans are individually called by God, adopted as his children and regarded as his friends. Therefore, he revealed himself for all generations, "I am who I am." By giving Moses his name, God becomes addressable as a thou, as a person, and communicates that he cares for every particular human being, for everyone who wants to call on him. The Christian personalism contradicts the Neo-Confucianism coming from the highest offices of the Chinese Communist Party, which seeks to unite everything under heaven through its ideology. As a party philosopher Xiao Tingyang argues, but everything is not the same as everybody, because the individual does not count in a system where a person has no divine splendor. The cultural history of humanity presents us countless lessons about the origin and future of humanity, not just as a species, but especially about the human person as an individual. The concretely existent person cannot be defined by general physiological characteristics or abstract concepts, cannot be evaluated according to function or usefulness to society, because as St. Thomas Aquinas put it so brilliantly, person signifies what is most perfect in all nature, that is, a subsistence individual of a rational nature. In every possible world, person is the pinnacle of being, as it is capable of thinking and deciding for itself. A person is an absolute singularity, which categorically resists being absorbed by another, taking advantage of and emptied by force. Therefore, Christianity has always denied that persons are annihilated after death, or that heaven is a nirvana in which the individual is dissolved like a sugar crystal in a cup of water. No, in the Christian visions of the person, the pleasure of being one's own being remains for all eternity. The Church owes this personalist truth to all mankind and must proclaim it, for truth has to be shared in order to bear fruit and to protect others from danger. Thus, the Catechism of the Catholic Church writes, the authority of the Magisterium, Pope, Bishops, extends also to the individual commandments of the natural moral law. It is necessary for salvation to observe them as the Creator requires. When the Magisterium of the Church recalls the precepts of the natural moral law, it exercises an essential part of its prophetic task of proclaiming to mankind where they are in reality and reminding them what they ought to be before God. Second point, the primary and secondary tasks of the ecclesial magisterium. The teaching authority of the bishops and the popes cannot be merely limited to the faithful and complete transmission of revelation and apostolic teaching. Teaching the faith also means integrating the intellectual and cultural horizon of the people of today and tomorrow, paying attention to their realities of life, which are shaped by technology and science, so that they can recognize and accept the Word of God as the Word of life. The prophetic teaching of the apostles and their successors does not mean foretelling future events, but rather proclaiming that Christ is the future for every human being for all eternities under all conditions. The Pope's office is to lead his flock toward a greater love for Christ. He steers the bark of St. Peter in boundless trust in the Lord, even when mighty tsunamis threaten the church with ruin. He remains the rock on which Christ safely built his church. The gates of hell do not prevail against her. St. Peter strengthens the faith of his brethren, that is, the pilgrim people of God and the struggling church. He keeps them strong in their faith in Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God, biblical expression against the dead gods of the pagans. By rejecting the destructive powers of sin within the church and the enemies of the gospel of the Son of God, he testifies that Christ is the author of life and our only hope. The universal mission of the Church is succinctly summarized and represented in the office of the Pope. Moreover, his office is witness and guarantor that the house of our faith was not built on sand, but on an unshakable rock on Jesus Christ, the Word of God made flesh. We therefore misunderstand the Pope's mission if we attribute to him only a moral authority, which even non-Catholics and non-Christians concede. Undoubtedly, the Pope's call for peace in the family of nations, for social justice, for the right of all to have a share in the goods and of the one earth carry great moral weight with governments in the United Nations and other international institutions. Polling data shows his office still receives the highest credibility among political and business leaders. It's not so difficult, no? Especially because papal diplomacy is not guided by self-interest, but by the common good, and seeks to bring out peace, freedom, and justice. Most often, however, the Pope's moral authority is only invoked by politicians when it suits their self-interest or that of their political party. It is abused in order to influence media cycles and elections. Thus, we should not ground the Pope's moral authority as the world's conscious in his status as a head of a state or a teacher of social justice. His authority is first and foremost religious, because he is the rock that Christ has raised for our faith in God, the creator of the world, who is the ultimate goal of our life. Yes, I am calling about every person, regardless of whether one is Catholic or non-Catholic. After all, everyone has the splendid gift of religious freedom and conscience, which orders us toward the truth and toward the good. In our conscience, we encounter the voice of God, presented to us in natural law. Natural law not is the environment, but the natural law is the nature of the reality, of the single realities which we can approach and understand by our reason. That is a natural law. And oriented on the holy will of God, for which the supreme ecclesiastical authority is the Pope, the ultimate interpreter. Even though the commandments that God revealed on Sinai, as well as his precepts in the Sermon of the Mount, are implanted in the heart of every human being, Romans 2nd chapter, the Church knows that sin continually obscures them. She therefore has to proactively and prophetically remind every person and society to shape one's conscience according to the divine will. Therefore, there is no contradiction between the immediacy of one's conscious decision and the necessity of the Church Magisterium to illuminate and educate this conscience, and ultimately to convert it to God. A conscience left to its own devices withers away. A conscience aided by spiritual counsel grows in holiness. At times, however, it is not enough for the prophets to only teach and advise, but instead must wake up a slumbering conscience. The Church has this duty especially when nationalist and economic self-interest threaten the common good, or when racist or financial ideologies endanger the equality and freedom of all people, of everybody, or when imperialist or colonialist plans call into question the fraternal unity of the human family. This need makes it necessary that the Church is in today's world, that it pays attention to what is going on and speaks up whenever the conditions for living and human flourishing are endangered. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Protestant theologian of Germany, summarized this task when he wrote from the Nazi prison, later he was killed by the Nazis, this famous word, the Church is only church when it is there for others. No? God said in the Old Testament, I am who I am there for present for you. and also the church is only church when it is there for others. In a letter to a friend, Eberhard Bethge, in August 44, the church must get out of its stagnation. We must get back out into the fresh air of the intellectual discourse with the world. We also have to risk saying controversial things if that will stir up discussion about the important issues of life. In the pastoral constitution, Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council confirmed that the Church offers on behalf of all people to be a sincere dialogue partner regarding urgent global challenges and to cooperate towards their solution. Interestingly, Gaudium et Spes does not mention the Pope in his function, in his capacity as the highest minister of the Church, which shows that this task is entrusted to the whole Church. Nevertheless, the Pope is a universal teacher and shepherd of the Church, and thus he encourages initiatives and calls on the entire Church to stay focused on this mission. This papal initiative can be clearly seen in the social teachings from Leo III to John Paul II's commitments to universal human rights, down to the theological foundation of ecology in Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si and his admonition about human brotherhood in Fratelli Tutti. Third, the person is the way of the Church. One of the great challenges of the 21st century is undoubtedly the protection of human beings at all stages of their development. The Church is the only community that has always risen to the occasion, emphasizing in her social teaching and moral theology the value of every human being. In the face of ever more devastating wars and crimes against humanity in all parts of the world, in which the dignity and the rights of human person become the plaything of the powerful and rich, the essential requirements for authentic human development are ignored. John Paul II, in his encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis, 87, insisted that the obligation to commit oneself to the development of peoples is not just an individual duty and still less an individualistic one, as if it were possible to achieve this development through the isolated efforts of each individual. It is an imperative which obliges each and every man and woman, as well as societies and nations. In particular, it obliges the Catholic Church. The family, the village, the city, the nation, the state, the family of nations, the whole world, and all of its inhabitants are at the service of people, their development, education, food, and property. The charitable commitment of the Church is part of her very nature. Benedict XVI emphatically pointed this out in his first encyclical Deus Caritas Est. This, however, does not mean that the Church should only passively react to the problems of the world poses. In fact, the Church and all Christian communities can shape the future by emphasizing the vocation of humanity in the story of God's creation. This future is reasonable and beautiful because it is grounded in God. Therefore, the Church can never tire of speaking about the dignity of the human person and its rights. After all, what does the vision of ideological pluralism have to offer, which rejects objective moral truth and robs people of that hopeful future with aggressive atheistic rhetoric? All it really offers is the struggle of humanity against itself. Struggle, everybody against everybody. It promises emptiness, not splendor. It talks about welfare, but never shows charity. In such a worldview, humans are not free until they have rejected all norm-giving authority and created their own values according to their appetites and desires. Without God, the preacher of these ideologies thinks that humanity is free, but fail to recognize that their concept of freedom does not even respect the freedom of others. By rejecting God, humans are degraded to being merely highly developed apes to their biological processes, and to a life in which no objective standards, values, and virtues exist. Whatever the world wide celebrates today can be abandoned tomorrow, since all their counterfeit values are based on majority decisions. It can change from day to day. A world in which such an ideology reigns is, however, a world without true hope and without true love. The only antidote to this frightening vision is to focus on the beauty of human person. That is why the Church emphasizes that each individual is more than a conglomeration of molecules. Just as we stand on two legs, we are constituted by two principles, soul and matter. The Church therefore emphasizes human person as a creature and the individual in community with dignity and rights. Within a secularized society that has surrounded to relativism and thus to the destruction of ethics, it has become more difficult to live the unconditional commitment to protecting the dignity of all humans, regardless how small, how old, and how healthy. After all, human rights need to be rooted in more than consensus in order to last and be truly universal. They must be based on the recognition of an authority that is beyond the reach of man. If we take the term person seriously, we recognize that person means more than psychological or sensory experience, but rather signifies an ontological reality. A person is a center and irreducible reality which with different characteristics are associated. Every human being, from conception to death, is a person. The quality of personhood is not inserted into our body at some arbitrary point of physiological development, but it is with us from the very beginning and merely unfolds over time. A person is not merely physical, but matures as a living soul, grows bodily and spirituality, also in times of trial and pain. A person also does not receive inherent rights from a government or judge. Respect for every person is a true measure of a human society. Only a civilization built on this truth can have a future. It will thrive if human rights and personhood are the yardstick for assessing human flourishing. St. John, Pope John 23rd, already articulated this when he presented in his encyclical Pacem in Terris, 63, as ingenious charter of Christian human rights. It declared wisely that every individual human being is truly a person. That includes by necessity all the very small unborn human beings. And is it really such a stretch of the imagination for us to universally accept that all human beings are persons, even if they cannot use reason or freedom to the same degrees as others? If we could arrive at a common understanding of the person, there could be a real chance that inequality will decrease, freedom will be restored, and dignity will be bestowed on all human beings on this planet. Pope John, 23. Fourth point, the Church as an advocate of human rights. The universality of human rights was established on the basis of the Christian faith substantially influenced by the experience of the New World, of the United States. They are based on the experience of the world as creation, of God's loving care for every human being, especially the oppressed, the poor, and the despised. The God of the Bible is, after all, not a distant myth or abstract entity. We have social distancing, but between God and human beings there are no social distancing. For every man. The God of the Bible is, after all, not a distant, but one who can be addressed as thou, you. This God hears rejoicing and lamentation, wipes away our tears and builds us up. This God is like a loving father whom the writer of the Psalm 63 addresses. God, I seek. My soul thirsts for you. My body cries out for you like dry, thirsting land without water. Therefore I look for you in the sanctuary to see your powers and glory. For your mercy is better than life. Therefore my lips praise you. You. Could anyone write such a prayer without having experienced the closeness of living God? The world and everything in it exists because of the goodness of God. God is a reason that anything exists at all, but humans have received more than mere being. They are called to be in eternal communion, relation with God, because they are made in his likeness and image. Thus, every individual owes his being to God's love, which is extended to him before he is capable of doing anything lovable, even before his parents love him. Thus, the Church is inherently qualified to speak up in the discourse about human rights and should anchor them safely in the gospel of Christ, as Gaudium et Spes rightly asserts. The Church, therefore, by virtue of the gospel committed to her, proclaims the rights of man. She acknowledges and greatly esteems the dynamic movements of today by which these rights are everywhere fostered. Yet these movements must be penetrated by the spirit of the gospel and protected against any kind of false autonomy. For we are tempted to think that our personal rights are fully ensured only when we are exempt from every requirement of divine law. But this way lies not the maintenance of the dignity of the human person, but its annihilation. Human rights are therefore not constructed by consensus or international organizations, but are deciphered and discovered by reason and revelation, and permanently placed before society as a binding norm. Human rights based on what is politically expedient, however, will always be unstable because a new majority can abolish them. It is only by anchoring them in God that they are removed from the grasp of arbitrariness. Thus, human rights can only be applied universally if the person as God's creation is at their center. Second Vatican Council, everyone must consider his every neighbor without exception as another self, a person, taking into account first of all his life and the means necessary to living with dignity. Recognition of the dignity of every human being inherent in the spiritual and moral nature of human person and its inalienable fundamental rights is a distinguishing feature of an authentic democracy. John Paul II stated prophetically in Centesimus Annus 91. Authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law and on the basis of a correct conception of the human person. History demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. In the face of the violation of the human dignity today and in the last century, fascism and communism, not only today but also in the past, one can not only cite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 48, or its recognition by democratic governance, but one can also invoke God, the creator of the world and of humanity. No one, however, can evoke God to justify the violation of human dignity. Terrorists who think they are doing God's will are not acting on God's behalf. The famous lecture of Benedict in Regensburg, no? God and terrorism, nothing to do. Their God is not the God of the Bible. Their God is a dangerous, demonic idol. Faith as a genuinely human act, actus humanus, in whatever historical context, is first and foremost a person's relationship with God through the act of worship in which one acknowledges the Creator as a source of truth and goodness. This, the observance of divine commandments and statutes, can never contradict this original religious act. Violation of human rights and blasphemy are two sides of the same coin. Whoever wants to justify crimes against humanity as obedience to God worships not God, but an idol, and ultimately the devil. They do not worship God, who is mercy and love, who created heaven and earth, and who called us, according to Christian anthropology, to be partakers of his eternal triune love. Human rights are, however, often formulated and produced without referencing transcendent power and absolute, but they are empty because they are subject to human arbitrariness. The world is contingent and therefore needs an anchor in the absolute, in the necessary. If one denies that human beings have such a reference point beyond themselves, something worldly will take its place. This can be a positive law passed by the majority of a parliament, a judicial panel, but such decisions are without sense because they change and are not built on a rock-solid foundation. History gives us an example such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, 1789 produced. It was rightly directed against royal absolutism and the exploitative regime of the aristocracy, but it did not stop the Jacobin reign of terror because it had no anchor in the absolute. Opponents or critics of the revolution were easily branded as enemies of the human race that had been exterminated like vermin. These human beings had suddenly lost their allegedly inalienable human rights. One calculates that 100,000 innocent victims died through beheading on the guillotine alone, not counting other victims such as those in the Vendée. Secular human rights grew from the starting point, as a Stanford historian said, the terror of natural right, which, as I might add, has changed its appearance, but is still very much at work in today's world. As beautiful as liberté, égalité, fraternité might sound, they are merely a secular imitation of the basic principles of the Christian human rights, which reason alone can grasp, and which the great French theologian and Archbishop of Cambrai, François de Fenelon, had formulated 3 generations earlier. And let us not forget that the revolution also did not invent the concept of human dignity, but the Christian Renaissance philosopher Pico della Mirandola in the 15th century, in his Oratio, on the title De Dignitatis Hominis, was the first occasion, I think, when this formula Dignitas Hominis was pronounced. The last point, fifth point, the world faces either progress or abyss. Our world faces the question, do moral freedom and civil freedom exist without God or through him? Without God, humans are merely an accident of evolution who only have temporal goals, such as material or cultural goods. Consequently, the idea of God is threatening to such a world because he is seen as a spoiler of self-rule and an adversary of freedom, a stumbling block of self-realization. Yet the Christian faith does not compare God to a tyrant or a social media influencer. Instead, the Church teaches that the eternal, good and merciful God is a real goal and the fulfillment of human intellect and will. His divine invitation breaks through to our ego, liberates us from selfishness, and gently calls us to join him because he is love. And his life is love. From a theological point of view, it is unnecessary to excuse the critical statements of human rights issued by the popes in the 19th centuries, as if the Church was too ignorant to accept modernity until 1963. After all, it is the right and duty of the Magisterium to point out that human rights, which are not grounded in the absolute, in God, are insufficient. This against the degradation in the French Revolution, not the contents, but the foundation was wrong and not sufficient. So far, I have not encountered convincing arguments that are able to ground human rights in something other than the divine. And it is historically as well as philosophically wrong to demand from the Church to accept such an insufficient foundation. Human rights, whether grounded in God or not, cannot define the highest goal of the spiritual, moral existence of man. They have only a protective function against the arbitrariness of the powerful in politics, finance, media, and military. They protect freedom. People who believe in God can cooperate with other people of goodwill in building a more just world, but should never make worldly goals absolute. We can never replace a final goal of human existence, being with God, with something which will ultimately pass from this world. After all, the only way back to paradise is through God. And earthly versions that humans have attempted to build, as history has shown us, has quickly turned into its opposite, in totalitarianism. This is a perennial teaching of the Church which rejects the unbridled and unrestrained sovereignty of state ideology just as much as the absolute autonomy of mankind. She points to democracy as the best form of government and society and admonishes that the rule of law is to be understood as a political community whose constitution embodies the values that correspond to the nature and the destiny of man. Many modern constitutions that emerged after the catastrophe of World War II and totalitarian rule in Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and Japanese imperialism enshrines these fundamental rights by invoking reverence for God and mankind. They give democracy a solid foundation, even if the active religious faith in their countries is rapidly declining. Pope John Paul II thus summarizes the human rights that logically follow from the dignity of human person made in God's image and likeness. Among the most important of these rights mention must be made of the right of life, an integral part of which is the right of the child to develop in the mother's womb from the moment of conception. The right to live is in a united family, mother and father, and in a moral environment conducive to the growth of the child's personality. The right to develop one's intelligence and freedom in seeking and knowing the truth. The right to share in the work which makes wise us of the earth's material resources, and to derive from that work the means to support oneself and one's dependents. And the right freely to establish a family, to have and to rear children through the responsible exercise of one's sexuality. One of the greatest Russian philosophers, Vladimir Soloviev, promoter of the unity of all the churches, along with the Pope, summarizes the religious and social dimension of Christianity in the following commandment. Pray to God, help people, conquer your nature, make yourself inwardly the image of Christ, the God-man. Recognize his real presence in the church and make it your goal to bring his spirit into all areas of human and natural life, so that through us heaven and earth are linked. Thank you very much.
Your Eminence, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. And I'm sure we have wonderful questions as well. The first question goes to Professor John Betts from the Theology Department.
Thank you, Your Eminence. You spoke of the Church's prophetic task to remind people what they are in reality, and to remind them, too, of what they ought to be before God. You also spoke of the analogy of being and of the human person in ontological terms. These are very metaphysical terms. Does this mean that the Church's prophetic task includes a metaphysical task? In the tradition of Shivara, Balthasar, Edith Stein, Ferdinand Ulrich, Balthasar spoke of the future Christian as one who would be a guardian of metaphysics. My question to you is, how true or important is this statement? And if metaphysics still is important today, when the truths of Platonic or Aristotelian philosophy are no longer as evident as they once were, how might we conduct this task today?
There's a most basic question and the problem of the theology of today and all of the science and of our self-understanding as human being. If we remain in the English empiricism, no, was absolutely anti-metaphysical, no, in David Hume, and was the highest point of the anti-metaphysic movement. And also our modern societies and self-understanding is rejecting the metaphysics. Friedrich Nietzsche against the metaphysics. Kant was ambiguous in his said metaphysic, yes, but we cannot realize it. But I think there is no alternative to the metaphysic. Is the explanation of the reality. No? The basis of all is a reality. Without being, as the source of all concrete existing realities, there is no it's not possible to understand anything. It's all is alternative. All our thoughts are so only products of our self, and it's only self-encountering. No? But it's absolutely clear that we know does exist in ourselves. No? The actus essendis outside of us. No? And therefore, all our thinking has a basis in the reality. And therefore, the revelation or the faith in the living God and hope and charity and also the theology as science is only possible if we have two main points: the reality, the being, and the understanding of the being in the reason. Omne ens est verum. No? The truth and the being. That's the two pillars on which all our thinking and all our existence, all our ethics is based. No? And we have seen the effects of this anti-metaphysical movements, no? The relativism, no? And the Nationalsozialism in Germany, no? Not what they did their crimes, but first in their thinking, the basis of their thoughts, has the roots in this anti-metaphysical effect. If there is no challenge of the reality, the dictator can decide what is true. No? Everybody in Germany was convinced that our neighbors, the Jewish people, are human beings like us. But there came the powerful definition: we define who is superior or inferior human being, the racist theory. No? But against the racist theory, against the definition of man in the communism, man is only a collection of the sociological conditions. You can never argument rationally against the consequences of these totalitarian systems. No? And if one not is interested in the metaphysics and the doctrine of the real being, he must only look to the sociological consequences. And he will see that the metaphysics and the philosophy and our conviction of the real revelation, our real relation to God, is that what can stop all forms of totalitarianism and anti-humanism. And the so-called transhumanism is not a transhumanism, it's an anti-humanism. No? And it's interesting that they are using the old Latin words, transhumanism, no? But the same people are saying we cannot understand what is transcendence. No? If you are able to understand what is transcendere, no? That is a logical formulation. No? Transhumanism is not a logical formulation, a contradiction in itself. The human being is the end of the will of God, and we are feeling that we have the responsibility. And it's a little bit ridiculous that there's a transubstantiation is impossible, no? In the Holy Eucharist. No? They say God is not able to convert the substance of bread and wine in body and blood of his Son. This is not possible. That we, finite human beings, are able to transform and transubstantiate the human nature. All this transhumanism is not only dangerous, is it is worst. It is ridiculous.
The next question is from Professor Paolo Carrozza from the law school.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence, for such a rich reflection for us. In your lecture, you had some compelling words to say against ideological pluralism. Its relativistic basis, it leads to the annihilation of the person, as you put it. In the world of human rights at a global level, however, there's also a different kind of pluralism which is present, which is not necessarily of this relativistic nature. It's a fact of pluralism which is reflected in very different conceptions of human dignity that are at stake. Some of them are even grounded in God, in other visions of God, whether it's karama in the Islamic tradition or the idea of dharma in the Hindu tradition or what have you. And these might be very closely related and yet distinct from the vision of dignity that you are articulating from the arising out of the tradition of the church. And then, of course, there are highly secular understandings of human dignity as well. So my question is that, Jacques Maritain, with whom you started your lecture, of course, was well aware of this when he was first involved in the work on human rights in 1948 and so forth. And when asked how he could reach agreement with others, he famously used to say, yes, we can reach agreement on the rights so long as no one asks why. And I wonder, given that pluralism, what the implications are for the points that you were making regarding the prophetic role of the church and the role of the church as an advocate of human rights, given the fact of these pluralistic foundations of dignity that we're not capable of overcoming, at least in the short run, and yet the demands of justice and of the common good require us to engage in the kind of cooperation that you were appealing to. So how do we, as Christians, engaged in constructing a world dedicated to human dignity and the common good, how do we address this deeply rooted fact of the pluralistic foundations exactly of human rights and dignity itself?
Yeah, surely we in discussion or dialogue with representatives of other religions or philosophies or world views, we cannot refer directly to the revelation. Man is created in the likeness and image of God because that presupposes the belief in the real existence of God in the sense of the Old and New Testament, the historical revelation. But when the Christianity entered in the Roman Greek culture, they were looking for a certain common basis. And when St. Paul was in Areopag in Athens, in Acts 17, there is a first theory we can say about it, explanation. All human beings are looking and searching for the truth. In the end, historically, came Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of all. But it was also a definition of a certain common human nature. The old Greeks, they believed in their gods, but they hadn't this concept of the human, an unconditional human dignity. They were later confronted with the Christian, with this Jews, with this concept. But if we come later to Seneca, philosopher Seneca, the Stoa, a contemporary of St. Paul and living for a certain time, some years must be, in Rome, and we don't know if they met, but it's astonishing the parallelism of the basic thinking. Here's the first, not the word, but the understanding that all human beings are equal. No? That cannot be possible that the one are the masters, the other are the slaves. No? That this is against the human nature. No? And therefore we have a proof that also a non-Jewish, non-Christian thinker came to these insights. No? And this was also the basis when the apostolic fathers and the first apologates, no? the apologates were in the discussion, Justin the Martyr, no? Were in discussion with the pagan philosophers and Origenes contra Celsus, contra Celsum was also this discussion, different meanings, but a certain common approach. No? But today, I think there are a legitimate pluralism because everybody has his conscience, his way of thinking as an individual and also in his community who is belonging to. But we need a common basis. No? We need a common basis, and I see no alternative must be the reason of man, but not an ahistoric reason or an abstract reason, but the reason of human beings together with the experience of historical experience we have. No? We are learning also, we hope so, from the history. And as I mentioned, we have this worst experience ever in the mankind, what we had in the 20th century. No? Great ideas of progress, all is coming better, and we can save the mankind by the modern technique and by our modern thinking, by our modern culture. But the result was absolutely counterproductive. And we have in Germany, after the Second World War, the Nazi time, surely there were great Christian tradition and the leaders were mainly Christians. But our constitution with the human rights has not only a formulation, an abstract deduction, the use of moral principles, since they are mentioning also the experience we had, what is happening when these values and truths are not respected. No? This was the identity, the founder identity of the post-Nazi Germany, no? And also in the other countries after the breakdown of the Iron Curtain in Germany and so. In these countries like Poland and so, they had gave themselves a constitution always together with this bad experience. And I think if we are discussing with the terroristic Muslims, no? They're referring to the Quran, we must understand, or they must understand, that is not only to referring to a word in the Quran, but they must also reflect that the beginning of the Quran is that God is a God of mercy, God of not love, but of grace and so. And that is the introductory phrase, the first surah in the Quran. No? And how to interpret it with this key, the other verses. No? And if you reflect, if God is the creator of everybody, it's impossible that one creature can decide about the life of another. No? They must wait the ultimate judgment of God. No? So we must find a common basis, no? And not unify all the thinking. It's not possible. But if we are living in one community and in the state, no? All states today are more or less pluralistic. No? Different religions are living together, and we need a common basis, and not only the decision of the parliament, because the parliaments tomorrow, they have another ideology. No? But it's not easy to find the solution for all. No? But we are convinced that only a common basis in the reason can be a certain fundament of living together.
The third question comes, Professor Carrozza, please, yes, a follow-up.
One very brief follow-up on that. You also stated quite eloquently that human rights cannot be grounded in consensus, which seems evident from the point of view of anything that's lasting or and not arbitrary. And yet what you said right now suggests to me that consensus, not as the grounding of human rights, but as the realization of human rights, is in fact quite critical. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that a right understanding of what you're saying?
The dialogue must come to a consensus. No?
The third question comes from Professor Brad Gregory from the History Department.
Thank you so much, Your Eminence, for being with us here at Notre Dame, your third visit you mentioned earlier. I come at this question as a historian, but a historian of the history of Christianity and its relationship to theology and lived human experience. I very much appreciated your talk as an eloquent distillation of a kind of theological anthropology of Christian personalism. Of course, Maritain himself was an important theoretician of that in the middle of the 20th century, and thank goodness we had Saint Pope John Paul II as a longtime occupant of the Papal See, who really made that a central part of his pontificate and his message for not only Catholics but the rest of the world. Part of the articulation of Christian personalism, as you expressed it in your talk, is that no one can invoke God to justify the violation of human dignity. And as you just mentioned a moment ago in your response to Paolo too, we can't be in a position of deciding life or death issues for other human beings, all of whom are equally created in the image and likeness of God, of course, as we know from Scripture. Now, the problem with history is that so often it didn't go down the way that we would like it to have happened. And this applies, sadly, to the history of the Church as well. And so my question for you is a dual one. It is about ad intra, Catholics' own understanding of their tradition, and ad extra, with respect to the prospects of evangelization and reaching out in all of the ways that the gospel can be and is beautiful when properly understood, in the light of the fact that many popes, many bishops, and many theologians throughout history have indeed explicitly invoked God to do precisely the violation of human dignity in the way that it is now understood in a Christian personalist way. With respect to the history of Christianity and Judaism, the history of Christianity and Islam, and certainly the history of Christianity in relationship to itself and those who were condemned as heretics and put to death. So I put this not as an accusation, but as a challenge, because if Catholics don't understand history and the history of our church in relationship to the theological claims that I agree with everything you said. If we don't understand that, then they're in for a rude awakening when they actually find out ugly things that happened. And we simply, I think, don't make credible the imperative to spread the gospel to others who are well aware of the history if we pretend that it didn't happen the way that it did. Thank you very much.
Surely the church history is not in all the justification of our doctrine. The doctrine is also critical against our history, and not only in the past. It's easy to accuse all the people living in the past, but it's a question for us now, to learn also from our church history what was wrong and not wrong. As you know, the first 3 centuries in the Roman Empire, the Christians were persecuted, and it was easier to speak about the human rights and the religious freedom and so. And then the relation of state and church was fundamentally changed. No? And in the Bible, the emperor has his word, no? For the earthen realities, and the apostles has only the word of God, the sacraments and pastoral care for the people leading them to God, and also to engage Christians for their neighbors, but not only beyond oriented religion, but also, as I said, also the responsibility for our life as a common good in this world. No? But later, the Roman empires, no, they didn't change principally their politics, but they used the Christian religions as a moment for stabilizing their empower, the worldly power. No? And in the later time, when the empire was broken down in the West, no, was the role of the Pope to protect Italy against the barbarians, the Saracens, the Muslims of this time, and later the Crusades were, in a certain sense, necessary against the Turkish invasion, Lepanto and Vienna and all these things, no? And was terrible in the Mediterranean when this Turkish, not Osmanic, of the North Africa, these states, no, made so many Christian slaves in Italy and the coasts of and therefore was necessary protection and making war against them, but it was not right that the Pope was this person. It must be the emperor or the king or the worldly authority protect these countries against the invasion. And also this idea that we must be one unified corporation, Christian corporation, Corpus Christianum in the Middle Ages, and that the heretics are not those who are only denying the revealed truth, but they are against the basis of the society. You know? And we have learned after this great times of the Middle Ages, but after all this Reformation, that this was not good. Cuius regio, eius religio. The princes decided what religion we have to have. No? This is absolutely against our principles. But you cannot have a faith to God, and it cannot be a virtue or a merit, your faith, if it's not absolutely free willingly. No? Credere est cum ascensione cogitare, no? San Augustinus. To believe as with your free will thinking. And theologically it was always clear that it's not possible to force the heretics with worldly power not to convert, but they did, and therefore I said also we can learn, no, of the errors of the religions, the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics and the Calvinists and so in Europe, no, in England, Germany, the war of 30 years, no, and that England was also very terrible. No? All the dissenters came to the United States, was also a moment of the beginning of the United States, and therefore here, United States, we have fundamentally other thinking of religious freedom as a fundament of the society. No? because, but otherwise in the old European countries was very difficult to imagine that a society can consist without the consensus in the religion. And then in the Enlightenment, or a little bit before, just in the School of Salamanca, no? When this contact was with the New World in South America, on the Thomistic basis, they developed this natural law. No? And then the Pope, Paul III, spoke about the freedom of the Indians, no? in South America. They cannot be forced with violence. No? And also we have so much documents, all of popes in the Middle Ages, that is not allowed to force the Jewish people to become Christians, but the reality was not always respected. The declaration of the Magisterium, like today. Our declarations of the popes are all very good. No? The question is if we are, as Catholics, as the first addressees, are realizing it in the concrete conditions in which we are living. No? But I think it's absolutely true. We cannot justify all what happened in the church history. It's what not only personal sins, all the time we are as individual sinners. That is not the point. That we as a society made wrong ways. No? That was a big problem. No? And we should and can learn from the history. But the condition is that we are study the history. Historia magistra vitae. No?
Your Eminence, we thank you very much, and you, as a good German, we are right on time, 5:29, because that would have been for a German probably considered sinful to go over time or to blow up a schedule. Let's give the Cardinal a warm thank you for his wonderful